Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our next lesson, which is called Using Algebra Tiles. Okay. Oops. Now, using algebra tiles. Often in class, we have shapes that represent algebra pieces. Okay. Now, remember, in algebra, we have variables and we have numbers that have been put together in combination. Now, we have little tiny squares, okay, that will represent integers. And they're different colors. When we are going to just draw them on paper, we're going to put their signs. So a red might mean positive, okay, and a square with a plus sign in it would represent one positive integer, like +1. If we had two of those squares with positives in it, we would have +2, etc. Now, there would be a different color, maybe green, representing a negative, and it would also, if we're drawing them, have a negative sign in it. So something like this, a small square, would represent -1. Okay? If we had 2 or 3 small squares, the 3 small squares with a negative sign in it would represent the integer -3. Now, another shape that we have is a long rectangle like this, and that long rectangle is a variable. Okay, so remember the squares are integers, right? And the rectangles are variables. Now, if again there is a plus symbol inside of it, or maybe a red color would represent a positive variable, so that would be like an X or a Y or an N, any variable. If we had a negative or a green colored bar, it might represent a negative variable like -X or -Y or -N. So we're going to use these shapes and these signs in there to represent our integers and our variables while we're using algebra tiles to solve equations. Now, you don't have to be using colors, just plus and positive and negative symbols inside of the shapes. Okay, so let's start with solving a simple equation by separating the variables and the integers. Okay? So in order to solve equations, we have to make sure that integers are on one side and variables on the other side. Now, just like when we were solving equations, we want our variables on the left. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, but as long as we separate them, we're going to be in good stead for being able to solve. Okay, so here is our equation. Very simple. X plus 2 is equal to 5. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to draw those shapes so that we can in fact separate them. Okay, so we're going to start with, and I'm just going to try and copy and paste these for you. Okay, so an X is represented by a rectangle. So I'm going to copy and paste a rectangle onto this side here on the left side. Okay, now that is a positive X, so I'm going to put a plus symbol in it. Okay, now also on that side I have +2, and those are integers. So I'm going to copy this square for the integer, and I'm going to paste it here. So we've got 1, 2 integers. Okay, I'll just move it over here to keep it a little neater. And so on the left side, we have a rectangle to represent that positive X, and now we're going to have 2 squares to represent that +2. Then on our other side of our equal sign, we've got +5, which is an integer. So I'm going to drop 5 rectangles here, or sorry, 5 squares here to represent those integers. Okay, so 3, 4, and 5. Now, that's +5, so I'm going to put the symbol of +5 in there. Okay, Now, in order to solve this, remember, we need to separate the variables and the integers. So what have we got? On this side, we have a variable, which is a rectangle, and we've got two integers, which are squares. So how do we get rid of those? Well, we get rid of them by, in fact, just like before, we've done add the opposite. So if we have two positive squares here, I want to get rid of those by adding two negative squares, right? So I'm going to put negatives in those, and remember, a positive and a negative become a zero. A positive and a negative become a zero. So what I've done is I've actually gotten rid of the two variables, or the two integers that were next to our variable. Just like in solving any equation, if we have two negatives that have been added to the left side, we have to do the same thing here. So I'm going to add two negatives to here. That keeps it equal on the left and the right side. Now, what do we have? We've got a positive and a negative that will become a zero. We've got another positive and a negative that will become a zero. And so now what is left? What is left is one variable and three positive integers. So that's our solution. Okay, so at the end of this, we're going to draw what our solution is. So our solution is one variable, oops, which I'm going to put down here. Okay. Whoa, what happened there? Let's try this again. Copy the rectangle. Ended up copying the whole thing. And that's going to equal three squares. So I'm going to put my three squares here, if they'll cooperate. 1, 2, and 3. And we have to put the signs in them. So that's a positive variable. And these are positive integers. So that's what we have left. One variable is going to equal three positives. Now I'm going to change this back into the same variable and back into integers. So that means that our variable is an x, which is now going to equal three positive squares, which is positive 3. There's our solution, okay? Just by separating the variables and the integers. Okay, let's try a second type of example. Now with this one, we have to solve by grouping, okay? We're going to solve the equation by grouping. So again, I'm going to draw a line here to separate my equal sign, my left and my right sides. Now what I need to do is have two x's on the left-hand side, and they're positive. So what that means is I need two rectangles. Two rectangles to represent my x's. And those are positive, so I'm going to put positive signs in them, okay? And then on the right-hand side, I've got the number 6, and those are integers. So I'm going to put 6 integers there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now I have to put their signs. It's positive 6, so I'm going to put plus signs into there. Now what you should notice is that the variables and the integers are separated. So I've got variables on one side and integers on the other. So I didn't need to move anything around to separate them. But now if I have more than one variable, I have to group them. Okay, so how do I know how many groups to make? Well, I've got 2 variables, so that means I have to make 2 even groups. So to make 2 groups that are even, there would be 3 integers in each group. So what does that mean? In the end, we're going to have one variable, okay, which is positive, is going to equal 3 integers, which are also positive. Okay, that's what we end up with in the end. One variable equals 3 integers. Now let's get the signs in there. That's a positive, and both of these are positives. So I want to translate it back into our question. So remember, the variable represents an x, and these 3 squares represent integers of positive 3, so x is equal to positive 3. So if we have more than one variable, we need to group, okay? If we have variables and integers on the same side of the equal sign, we need to separate them, okay? So let's go through and look at one where we have to do separating and grouping, okay? So we're first going to separate, and then we're second going to group, okay? So I'm going to draw a line here to separate my left and my right side. I'm going to draw what we see there. So there's 3 x's, so I'm going to draw 3 rectangles. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and they're both positives, all of them, so we're going to put positive signs. Now I also have 2 positive integers, so that means I'm going to have to put 2 small squares to represent those. So dang it. Try again, just copy the square and put 2 squares here. And remember, it's 3 positive x's and it's 2 positive integers, so we're going to put a plus there. Now, on the other side, we have 7 negatives. So that means I need to put 7 squares, and then I'm going to put negative signs in them, okay? So there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay. And I need to put negative signs in there because those are -7. So the first step, remember, is to separate. So I have to get these integers away from those variables. So what I'm going to do is if I have 2 positives, I'm going to add 2 negatives. So that's going to make them zeros, so they will disappear, right? So we're going to put negatives here, whoops. And a positive and a negative are going to become a 0. Another positive and a negative become a 0. So we've eliminated them from the left side. Now, if I put 2 negatives on the left, I also have to put 2 negatives on the right. Okay. Now, there's nothing that's going to cancel out here because there's only positives and negatives cancel. So now, once we've done our separating, we're then going to be moving on to grouping. So how many groups are we going to have? Well, because we have 3 variables here, we need to have 3 groups. So now we need to decide, how can we make 3 even groups? If we put 2 in each group, that's only going to take up 6 of them, okay? So I guess I need to put 3 in each group. So there's one group of 3, there's another group of 3, and there is a third group of 3, okay? So now I'm going to draw a line so that we can show what is the result. So what it results in is that one rectangle is going to equal 3 squares. Okay, and I need to get my signs in there. So this is going to be a positive variable, and these are going to be negative integers. And when we translate that, in this case, again, the variable was an x equals now -3. That's our solution, okay? X is equal to -3. Now, there is another type of question, and this is more complicated. And if we do this, when we need to do this is if our variable is negative, okay? So what we have to do first is we have to change that variable to a positive by adding the opposite variable. So we have to make the variable positive. After we've done that, the second thing is to separate, and the third thing is to group. Okay, so let me show you what this will look like. So I'm just going to draw a line to separate our left and our right side. We're going to draw what we have. So I have to start with a rectangle to represent those two ends. So 1, 2 ends, and they are negative, so we're going to put a negative sign in them. And then what we also have next to that is 4 positive integers. So I'm going to draw 4 positive squares. Okay. And that means I'm going to put a positive sign in them. Okay, on the right-hand side, I've got 8 positive integers, so I'm going to put 8 squares. Okay. And again, they're positive, so once I've got these down, I'm going to put plus signs in them. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 positives. Okay, so the next step is going to be, I've got to make these variables positive. Okay, so what does that mean? I have to add the opposite. So if this is a negative variable, I'm going to add a positive variable. Okay, if I add a positive variable to the left side, I have to add a positive variable to the right side. So let's put their signs in them. Okay, so now if I take a negative variable and I add it to a positive variable, I get 0 variables, right? Add a negative and a positive together, I get 0 variables. So now I've got no variables left on the right-hand side, but I have 2 positives here, okay? Now, it's very labor-intensive to, in fact, flip this around. So I'm not going to expect you to flip it. All I want us to do now in the next step is to separate, right? So what we've got is integers and variables. So we're going to need to separate those. So I'm going to draw a line. So our next step is to separate. So what I want to do is get rid of the integers that I've got put next to the variable. So we're going to add 8 integers, and they have to be the opposite of what is there so that we can get rid of them. So because they're positive on this side, we're going to get rid of them by adding 8 negatives. Okay? Because 2 of those will cancel 2 of those, 2 of those will cancel 2 of those, etc. So now we got rid of the integers on the right-hand side. Now, if we add integers to the right-hand side, we have to add the same integers to the left-hand side. So we're going to go and add 8 negatives onto this side. Okay. Now, remember, these are negatives, so let's put our negative sign in there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 negatives. Now, what we have to do is get rid of any zeros that we've created. So again, 2 positives are going to cancel 2 negatives, and another 2 positives are going to cancel another 2 negatives. So what's left? What's left is 2 positive variables on the right-hand side and 4 negative integers on the left-hand side. So our last step is to group. So if we go to group, again, we decide by how many variables we have. So because we have 2 variables, we're going to create 2 groups. Well, what would be in each of those 2 groups? We would have 2 negative integers. So let's write what we have on this side. We have 2 integers. I should have put a line between. I'm just going to move these down. I'll put a line to just separate what's happening here. So every rectangle has 2 integers. So we're going to copy 2 integers on the left is 1 rectangle or 1 variable on the right. This is a positive variable and 2 negatives. Remember, there's an equal sign in between, so that means -2 is equal to our variable. In this case, it is an n, so n equals -2. Now we'll just flip it around and have n is equal to -2 in the right order. I just didn't want you to have to redraw it with all of the variables on moving them to the other side by flipping it. It was just too much work, so I don't expect you to do that until the end. Okay, so recapping, right? If you have integers and variables on the same side, you need to separate them, okay, as the first step. In this case, we only got one group, one variable, so we just created one group of integers. On the second example, we had more than one variable, so we needed to go to grouping. They were already separated, so grouping would just create the answer. In the third example, we had a number of variables and integers on one side, so we needed to separate them first and then group them, and one integer equaled, one variable equaled so many integers. In the last example, we had to make the variable positive first by adding the opposite. Then we needed to separate, and then we needed to group, and lastly, flip it. Okay? So if you've got a negative variable, you need to add the opposite, separate, then group. Those are the toughest ones. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Take care and hope to see you soon. Bye.